I remember my brother Tom, he was winding a very black tube with very green wire. And I looked at it and I said, what are you doing? Oh, he said, this is wireless. And the whole tactile feeling of that lovely thing so engrossed me that I said, well, I must be a wireless engineer. You made a wireless set, and then it suddenly became alive and chattered of everything that ever was, and people boasted. Actually, I got station Zonk in Czechoslovakia while I was upstairs changing my shirt with the phones on the kitchen table.
The voice of one of radio's great pioneers, Peter Eckersley. Today, he's far from a household name, but back in the days before the BBC had even been conceived, Eckersley was radio's first real star. When the BBC was born in November 1922, 90 years ago, he was its first chief engineer. And his will be one of my guiding voices through this prehistory of the BBC, in which I'll be exploring the story of the men and women who turned a relatively silent Victorian England into an isle full of voices. The official historian of the BBC, Jean Seaton.
Eckersley was immediately a hit because he'd got joie de vivre. He bubbles with cultured excitement. Eckersley wanted lots of people to listen. They kind of knew the power of this new medium to transform people's lives.
I've often thought of those early days, and of course one gets captured by nostalgia. But at the same time, I do think that before administration and organisation overtook the BBC, there was a certain naturalness that, although it was perhaps not so beautifully regulated, not so suave, so polished, so dressed in spats as it may be today, nevertheless there was a spirit that came over of people trying and of possibly not succeeding, which to me, as a listener, is much more exciting than almost anything else.
I'll be seeing you. The era into which radio, or as it was known then, wireless, was born was a firmly Victorian one. The great machines of the Industrial Revolution were in full swing, producing things for the empire, and what we'd now call a technological revolution was radically changing the face of ordinary life. The telegraph, and better still, the telephone, were making it possible for people to communicate with one another as never before, and thanks to Mr. Edison's phonograph, you could even listen back to what you'd just been saying. And by the time a couple of Frenchmen from Lyon had managed to record human movement on film, a young inventor from Bologna called Guglielmo Marconi was playing about with what was known as wireless telegraphy. It was a busy time, and yet it was still a pretty quiet one. The former professor of radio at Bournemouth University, Sean Street.
It was a very silent world, and I think when we look back on those days, we are looking actually into almost a Victorian England, where things really hadn't changed, particularly in rural England, for, one could almost say, centuries. You know, the world of Thomas Hardy. I always think of Thomas Hardy because I think he epitomises the generation born in the middle of the 19th century who lived to the late 1920s, born into a world where his mother said she could remember what the weather was like when she heard about the French Revolution, to live to see cars, aircraft and radio. You could argue no other generation has lived through such an extraordinary social change as that generation.
And indeed, it can't be an accident that there were two great modern inventions around public entertainment, one of which was the first publication in 1896 of the Daily Mail by Northcliffe, one of the kind of entrepreneurs of public entertainment. And the same year, Marconi first really makes a broadcast in 1896.
I made acquaintance with Mr. Marconi in April 1896 when I was on holiday at Bournemouth, and he was working his wireless telegraphy between the Isle of Wight and Bournemouth, and he invited me to go and see it.
Sir Archibald Fleming, eminent man of science, one of the developers of the first radio valve, and later one of the BBC's first regular performers in front of the microphone. But that's jumping ahead. Back to the Marconi test transmissions.
And I have not yet forgotten my surprise when I received a message sent to me by Maxwell Waves 12 miles overseas, printed down in dot and dash on paper tape saying compliments to Professor Fleming.
He was a young boy when he began to do his experiments inside his country house.
This is Marchesa Maria Marconi, the inventor's second wife.
He made his first experiments through the window facing, you see, the hill. He knew that his first signal would have been heard on the other side of the hill, where there was a peasant who was with a gun shooting when he heard the first signal. And then it was the birth of the wireless.
The extraordinary thing about Marconi is that when he was amazing the eminent professor in Bournemouth in 1896, he was still only 22. He'd grown up in Bologna, but his mother hailed from the Jameson whisky dynasty.
Nei primi giorni di dicembre del 1901 arrivai a San Giovanni e in brevissimo tempo feci.
So it was that later the BBC captured him speaking not only in his native Italian, but also in his impressively fluent English.
In December 1901, I was able for the first time, by means of stations specially constructed for that purpose, to transmit and receive telegraphic signals right across the Atlantic Ocean, from Poldhu in Cornwall to St. John's, Newfoundland.
The most interesting thing about Marconi, in comparison to our specialised modern times, was he was a jobbing inventor. He invented this, he invented that, he invented the other. He was a kind of later 20th century word, boffin, which doesn't quite capture him, but he was an inventor. He was an entrepreneur who thought that you could make money out of inventing things.
It was shortly after midday, on December the 12th, 1901, that I placed a single earphone to my ear and started listening. The receiver on the table before me was very crude. No valves, no amplifiers, not even a crystal. I was at last on the point of putting the correctness of all my beliefs to test. The experiment had involved risking at least £50,000 to achieve a result which had been declared to be impossible by some of the principal mathematicians of the time.
And the station at Poldhu was instructed to send out the letter S, 3 dots, 3 short electric discharges at certain times. After some trials, Marconi was able to hear at St. John's, Newfoundland, 3 ticks denoting the letter S and showing that these wireless waves sent from Poldhu had travelled round the Earth for 3,000 miles.
So I'm now in Chelmsford in Essex at Chelmsford Science Education Centre, Sanford Mill. And I'm here with Jeff, who's the curator, who's showing me around. And Jeff, this is
all ship stuff. This was in many ways where Marconi started. He was very much a boatman. He loved being on board ship. He spent large parts of the latter part of his life on board ship experimenting with radio, or wireless as he called it, wireless telegraphy.
And so showing off their collection of early Marconi transmission equipment was the museum's curator, Jeff Bowles.
This is, I suppose, the second generation of Marconi equipment here, dating from the 1900s.
And what is it?
Right. The transmission side was what they call spark transmission. If you turn on the light switch in your kitchen slowly and have the radio going, you'll hear interference.
Right.
And if it oscillates at the right frequency, it can start radiating radio waves.
Yeah.
Now, if you hold the Morse key down while you count to 3, you get a long series of bursts of energy, which is your dash. And if you hold it down for 1, you get a short series, which is your dot. So it's that simple to send messages once you've got the induction coil as a transmitter.
We start with Marconi.
Sean Street.
He transmits across the Atlantic in 1901. This opens up the whole world of ship-to-shore, obviously the Titanic and all those kind of things, the part that wireless played in those disasters and in the developing world of transport and travel comes out of that.
Quickly adopted by shipping companies, Marconi's invention was soon proving its worth. And in 1910, events provided the ideal front-page advertising opportunity. Fleeing justice, the notorious wife murderer Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen had boarded the SS Montrose for New York. But the ship's captain spotted him and told his telegraphist to send a message to shore. Have strong suspicions that Crippen, London's cellar murderer and accomplice, are among saloon passengers. Crippen was arrested, and Marconi took the credit. In disasters at sea, too, the Marconi system was proving a literal lifesaver. John Scott Taggart was a radio operator handling messages from the stricken ship Volturno.
The last message which the operator sent was, "For God's sake, can't anybody come and help us?" Well, 10 ships went to help them. And I knew all the names of the people who were rescued, and 160 people lost their lives, but 600 were saved, and that was done entirely as a result of wireless calls. It was a tremendous boost for ship wireless communication. And of course, it was very exciting for a boy of 16.
So far, the wireless we've been talking about was exclusively of the dot and dash Morse code variety, spark-generated pulses that were effectively a kind of cipher and had to be transcribed to make any sense. But what about actual radio, the sound of the human voice?
In 1906, a man called Reginald Fessenden, a Canadian inventor, experimented using Marconi's basic equipment with some modifications, but using it for speech and music and so forth. And he transmits literally a program in 1906, when we look back on it, that contained all the elements that we would put into a program now. It contained a reading by an actor, it contained some live music, it contained a recording, a disc of Handel's Messiah, and it was linked by Fessenden himself as, if you like, a continuity announcer. All the elements that we still put into our radio programs now were there in 1906. And Fessenden, who wasn't a broadcaster, who wasn't a radio engineer, he was just an inventor, happened upon this format. Ships picked it up. They thought it was the second coming, because they'd come out of this silent world. Suddenly, on Christmas Eve, there's the Hallelujah Chorus. And it's old Fessenden in Brant Rock, Massachusetts, trying out this new medium. Now, nothing happens after that. It's a 9-day wonder. Why is that? Probably because Fessenden was actually ahead of his time, and the commercial infrastructure just wasn't there to capitalise on this medium. What you need, actually, in all technology, sadly, is a war.
I was listening to the broadcast in German from Nauen, in the outskirts of Berlin.
Radio operator Kenneth Alford.
And I noticed that he was sending out one particular sentence, time after time. Krieg ist erklärt gegen Russland und Frankreich. War is declared against France and Russia. This poignant message from Berlin is probably the most exciting message I've ever taken.
So was that what Marconi was really interested in, the kind of Morse code and the transmitting at sea and all that kind of thing? And did voice radio almost come about as not exactly an afterthought, but a kind of unanticipated byproduct from all that?
The company as a whole didn't become interested in that until after the First World War. The company was taken over by the Admiralty, and the whole thing was geared towards producing enormous quantities of ship's radio equipment.
So this is the spot, in many ways, not where radio was born, but where it grew up in Britain. 100 years ago, where I'm standing here in New Street in Chelmsford, the Marconi company moved into the biggest, the most state-of-the-art, the most exciting radio factory premises, probably in Europe. And it was right here that they made the components, that they developed the technology, initially for radios to be used at sea on ships. It looks a bit sad now. There's broken windows, boarded up, in a typical kind of factory building in the process of redevelopment. And yet there's a kind of nobility to it, I guess a kind of grandeur. The facade is still pretty impressive. It's in this kind of pale yellowish brick that you get out here in Essex and East Anglia. And above the door, still in gold paint, the word Marconi's. A name that at the beginning of the 20th century, I suppose, was really one of the great names, a name to conjure with, a name that meant the future.
The most riveting thing about broadcasting was that the capacity to reach lots of people looked like a real mistake in the technology.
Professor Jean Seaton of the University of Westminster.
Because what you wanted to do was be able to communicate securely from one person to another person, because that looked like it might be militarily useful and commercially useful. And indeed, broadcasting as such was shut down both in America and Britain and in Germany, all during the First World War, because it was worried that stuff would leak out on it. So the leakiness of broadcasting looked like a technological fault to be sort of eradicated from the system. I mean, so the capacity to broadcast to lots of people was scientifically available for nearly 30 years before it was socially invented as something that people would do.
One of the many people fascinated by these newfangled inventions with their coils, wires and batteries was a flamboyant young man called Peter Pendleton Eckersley. He'd been born in Mexico, where his father had been in charge of building the Grand Mexican Railway. When Marconi was first dazzling the world with his wireless transmissions, Eckersley was just 4 years old. But his story runs through the tale of early radio broadcasting like a vein through marble.
I do think that probably the first manifestation of the power of broadcasting was in the United States of America. A delightful man whom I knew very well called Conrad of the Westinghouse Company of Pittsburgh, PA. And he just had one of the wireless transmitters, and he had a microphone, and it occurred to him that on a Saturday night he might give the boys a treat, and he put on a few gramophone records and so on, and everybody, the amateurs, listened, and they enjoyed the little sounds that were coming out, because, you know, if you got a wireless set as an amateur which had never done more than go pa 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 pa, and then suddenly you heard a voice or even music, I mean, it was fascinating. And the date, well, 1919, 1920.
The war was over, and in England the development of wireless began afresh.
We set up this receiver of mine with a loudspeaker, rather a horn, something like this, in various halls in Guildford, and reproduced over this loudspeaker the new wireless.
Arthur Hazelhurst, a radio amateur in Guildford, using the miracle of wireless to raise money for charity.
And we charged people sixpence to come in and hear the wireless, this newfangled business, and sixpence extra if they wished to tune the receiver. But there was a small Dutch station, PCGG, used to come up on Sunday afternoons for the benefit of wireless amateurs, and it was possible to hear those Sunday afternoon Dutch concerts, as they were called.
For the moment, though, wireless in Britain was limited to a sort of testing, can you hear me regime, only really relevant to people with a technical interest in, say, the strength of the signal or the distance travelled by the radio wave. Even George Hemmings, a keen radio amateur, eventually tired of the endless reading of railway timetables.
The announcer in Chelmsford would announce that they was going to transmit, and he would give the time and date, and then he'd start reading, and he read on until a certain time, and then he would give the time, and then he'd pause for a little while, then on again.
But on the 15th of June 1920, Marconi's factory in New Street, Chelmsford, was the setting for an extraordinary first, a moment that changed our cultural history forever. Jean Seaton.
Dame Nellie Melba was the diva of her age. She was known everywhere. She did extraordinary concerts. She was Australian, but she was hugely regarded. The Daily Mail thinks that this new broadcasting lark might be something it can make a fuss about. So it gets Dame Nellie Melba in 1920 to trundle out to Chelmsford and sing.
From a very hastily arranged shed. They'd established a telephony aerial over the site, and they'd brought in before her a local singer called Winifred Collins. She was a local celebrity in the later years, but she broadcast first. They had a musical group, rather nice name, called the Funyuns, who used to broadcast. But the Dame Nellie was the one that caught hold of everyone's imagination.
I belonged to the Radio Hams Club then, and somebody said, "Would you like to go and hear the Dame Nellie Melba?" So I said, "Too true." But we only just got into the shed. We went down New Street and just in the door, and the announcer got up and announced what she was going to sing. But of course, we was well back. There was plenty of high ups.
The place where she broadcast had a concrete floor. It was just a shed. And somebody thought, well, this is a very important person. And they went to the local man and asked for a carpet for Dame Nellie Melba. And when she saw it, she said, "Roll that damn thing up. How can I sing on a carpet?"
So it's one of those great events in which broadcasting, rather like perhaps the televising of the Queen's coronation, suddenly becomes, we'd say these days, it goes viral. It becomes an event.
So do you think the Nellie Melba concert is the kick-off point, really, for radio in Britain?
For radio broadcasting, yes, I would say it was. I mean, if you wanted to hear Dame Nellie Melba previously, only a very, very tiny proportion of people would ever hear her in her life, and the celebrity of these people, precisely because of that, was absolutely enormous. And the idea that you could sit in your living room, actually hear her, when for the rest of your life you had no possible means of going to attend a concert, it was absolutely mind-blowing, yes.
Now, to get permission to make radio transmissions, you had to ask the Post Office, headed by the Postmaster General. But the Post Office was getting distinctly cold feet. In areas like civil aviation, they thought, wireless voice radio could have a serious purpose. But trivial, crowd-pleasing stunts like the Melba concert would just get in the way. And for a reminder of the dangers, they needed only look across the Atlantic, where unregulated and unsupervised American wireless had got completely out of hand. Noel Ashbridge was another young man closely involved with the Marconi experiments, who, like Eckersley, later rose to the top of the BBC's engineering department.
America had opened the world's first broadcasting station, KDKA, East Pittsburgh, in 1920. But of course nobody in Europe ever heard it. In fact, listeners heard little but Morse signals as they twiddled the knobs of their sets, with occasional telephony tests or a concert from the station at The Hague.
Meanwhile, in America, broadcasting had started, and competing stations were indeed broadcasting against each other. And it was very difficult to actually hear what anybody said, because as soon as you twiddled your cat's whisker and you managed to find one station, another one would intervene. And the British Post Office went to America, and they came back actually, frankly, glamorised by the excitement of America, but disapproving of the anarchy that American broadcasting had let forth. And they come back and say, well, we're obviously going to have this broadcasting stuff, but we don't want to have all this American anarchy because you can't pick up a station, but also I think you can't control it.
Well, in this country, of course, you know, we carry red flags in front of the microphone.
Peter Eckersley.
We carried them in front of the motor car, and the Postmaster General, on whom be everlasting peace, he realised that we couldn't have such a thing as this without committee judgment and serious consideration.
At last, it was announced that a wireless telephony program would be permitted once a week for half an hour. The station chosen was Writtle, with a power of 0.5 kilowatt.
I happened to be in the Marconi Company at the time, and we inhabited a place called Writtle, a hut, long, low hut full of long, low people. And we had a wireless transmitter, and we were eventually appointed by the Radio Society of Great Britain to do this thing called broadcasting.
Hello, CQ. Hello, CQ. This is 2 Emma Tuck. 2 Emma Tuck. This is 2 Emma Tuck calling. Is that all right, Ash? Kirk, is it all right?
And Jeff, this is, I think I'm right in saying, the original hut. Is it Marconi Hut?
This is the hut that was down at Writtle, and it was where the first regular radio broadcasts came. We always say regular because nothing is quite that simple. 30 first regular broadcast at a specific time. Tuesday evening, 7:30, turn on, and there's your radio programme. First time in the country that happened.
And the hut itself, is it a sort of First World War hut?
Yes, the Marconi factory site was full of army huts. That's where they did their research. So this hut was established at Writtle with the idea of researching into aircraft radio.
And so how did it become converted into this kind of broadcasting hub, if you like?
Aircraft radio in those days demanded voice radio. Now, the Dame Nellie Melba, the famous concert, was heard all over the world. It was also heard in all the local airport as well. And the post office said, we can't have this. So they licensed this as a low-power station. And it was, at that time, in a field at Writtle, about 2 miles west of Chelmsford.
We hurriedly hired a piano from the nearest shop, 3.5 miles away, and in due course we went on the air, quite casually and without any cheering. Britain's first regular broadcasting station.
At first of all, it was terribly formal. The man picked up the microphone and said, "Hello, CQ, this is 2 Emma Tock, Writtle calling. And we will now play you a gramophone record entitled." The curious thing with a gramophone record is always entitled, they're not called anything. And we just put on the gramophone record, and then it was switched off. And then we had to wait 3 minutes to listen out to find if we were interfering with legitimate services.
So if you'd approached the hut across the fields?
It was infield, it was down Lawford Lane in Writtle, so it was a small country lane that went nowhere else really.
And if someone had wandered across the fields and come across the hut, they'd have found it almost sort of humming, would they, with the power and
they'd have certainly wondered.
Energy.
I mean, the locals did wonder. We interviewed a lady many years ago. She was talking about the funny things they had on their heads.
The headphones.
They didn't know about headphones. What on earth are they doing, these strange-looking people, like something from outer space, And they had their supper in the pub across the road. They borrowed the piano from the pub across the road. And one of them married the, not quite the barmaid, one of the relatives of that family. So they settled in.
The programmes later became a little more frivolous. There was a time when I used to go home and let the others do the transmissions, but one time I stayed and had some dinner at the local, and then I sort of suddenly felt that perhaps this formality was a little bit much, and picked up the microphone, jabbered, didn't shut down for any 3 minutes, and next morning, when we came in and had a post-mortem, all the staff sat around and said, this. I said, "Oh, did I say that? Oh, my God."
From Marconi's London headquarters, Arthur Burrows, who was a key backstage presence in those first wireless broadcasts, would send down what we would call a playlist.
Actually, the programme material came from Arthur Burrows, who was chief publicity man at Marconi House, and he used to send down the records, and he used to send down, I suppose about every other week, an artist, a sort of 10 guinea person, who came down, plus expenses, 10 guineas in those days.
Like Winifred Collins.
There was big cases, wooden cases and that all around. We sort of had to step over them and all the different equipment to find a little table and talked into a microphone. There was a song at that time that was quite popular, and it was very short. It was called Absent, but I sang that. But we had to start off with a tuning fork and the hum of the electrical things that were going on at the same time. I think I got 10 shillings a night. I thought it was wealth. In those days, it's a long time ago,
So they'd go to the Cock and Bell before every Tuesday, is it, before they transmitted?
When they were doing a concert, according to legend, they put a piano on a wheelbarrow and wheeled it on. But so when they were doing a concert, they would have moved this piano. We actually have the piano.
And this is the piano they used?
That's the piano they used from the Cock and Bell pub, yes.
Fantastic. And it sort of still works.
It's horrendously out of tune. Well, it hadn't been used for years because it survived because it had been walled in an upstairs room in the pub.
So they would play ballads, comic routines. What would they do on the piano?
They did everything in the broadcasts. The piano was for rather special occasions. I mean, shown here, we've got Nora Scott, who is about to sing, who was brought all the way from London. But they had a gramophone which they used to play. It was rather nice because the gramophone's designed to go in a very posh lounge, had doors on so you couldn't see the speakers all the time. And the engineers used those as the volume control. Gradually opening the doors, and you've got this sort of fade in and fade out of the music. And that was how it was done.
Very ingenious.
And if you wanted it louder, you just moved the microphone nearer. If you wanted it softer, you moved the microphone further away. We were able to keep one of the smoothest volume control that has ever been invented.
Well, it is. Oh, it is. Hello, CQ. This has all been going on. I'm sorry there was a bit misunderstanding. A little bit of a technical hitch. Yes, you have them too. I know, aren't they awful? But anyway, I think we'll be ready to begin now. And the first thing I've got to introduce...
The other thing that Eckersley does is understand that somehow broadcasting is not like a speech or a meeting.
Broadcasting historian Gene Seaton.
It's you to another person who's listening. And so he gets this conversational tone. He doesn't get all stiff. And he knows that although there's one of you and you're broadcasting to many, for each individual listener, you're talking to them with a certain authoritative intimacy. Eckersley absolutely instinctively found his way to a tone of address that was then used later in the BBC.
And we were indeed not only pioneers in transmission, we were pioneers in programme. We in fact did the first radio play that I suppose was ever broadcast.
The Riddle chap's choice of play was pretty upmarket. Worse, it was French. Émile Rostand's drama about the man with the prominent hooter, Cyrano de Bergerac.
And we chose that bit where Cyrano makes love to Roxane in the balcony as a deputy for the young man, remember? And of course that is played on the stage in the dark, so we thought that was pretty well suitable for sound broadcasting.
Cyrano de Bergerac, rehearsed, presented, performed, modulated, and I think almost knocked off the air due to overmodulation by one P.P. Eckersley.
Yeah.
Rolls Wynne was Peter Eckersley's partner in the more experimental Riddle offerings.
The cast consisted of course, P.P. Eckersley, Cyrano, Marion Travers, Aggie, Dennis Ross.
Yes.
I think was the rustling leaves. It's about as far as I was trusted. But what is most memorable about that, the way bearing in mind the way things are done now, was the rehearsal which took place about an hour before it went on the air, when we solemnly handed round a spoon representing a Peel Connor microphone.
So you've got a photo here, Jeff, of the Riddle site. And these were taken from what, Marconi's own plane?
Yes, they had a little biplane.
I mean, it literally is a hut in a field. And you've got over here one of the original microphones. I mean, to me, well, it's nothing like the microphone that we're using right now. I mean, it really does look like a bit fallen off an old telephone or something. I mean, is that fair?
Yes, it's very, very simple. I suppose it's a carbon granule microphone.
And what's this thing?
This is a mock-up of a crystal set. It's a big cheat. It's all on a sound chip. But you can tune it in, and then if we tune the set, can you just hear the voice coming in?
Yeah, I can hear it now. There he is. That kind of clipped, high kind of voice that people had. But you can imagine, can't you, if you were one of the first listeners, it must have been so exciting to hear this voice coming at you across the airwaves.
Yes, and it would have been at this volume as well, very, very low volume.
So you'd have had to really
just
concentrate.
Coming through the headphones,
Very good.
There you are, and that's the gramophone on that occasion.
While Eckersley and co were having great fun in an army hut in a field outside Chelmsford, in the heart of London, a more formal broadcasting structure was beginning to take shape.
And here we are at Marconi House. Now this was the place that, was Marconi's headquarters in London. This is where Marconi broadcasts from. Their call sign was 2LO. And effectively this building, adjoining the Strand, is where the BBC started.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO, Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO.
And this is what's happened to Marconi House now. How are the mighty fallen? Magnificent apartments and penthouses with bespoke services, says the sign. A unique collection of suites and 1 and 2, 3 bedroom apartments within a Grade 2 listed facade. Adjoining a new 5-star hotel, Marconi House offers an exclusive lifestyle in a world-class location in the heart of the West End. They should be paying me for this.
Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO, Marconi House, London.
I think it was late September 1922. I was hauled out of the lesson to the telephone, and a voice said, can you collect 1 or 2 people and come up and do an experimental concert in Marconi House?
2 of the people who made their way up the stairs from the bustle of the Strand were the music hall artist Helena Millay and a young singer who would later become famous as a radio actress, Vivian Chatterton.
The voice said, well, it's for a new invention called wireless. And I said, well, what's wireless? And the voice said, well, it's a means whereby music is going to be brought into people's homes. So I got a couple of people, and I was going to sing Max Brooks' Ave Maria. And in due course, we got to Marconi House and were taken up in a lift to a little tiny room right at the very, very top of the house, which was an absolute shambles. I can't tell you. The floor was cluttered up with wires, and there were cases and goodness knows what. There was a piano.
And I was taken up to the top of Marconi House in a very tiny room, hung with sort of white butter muslin.
A dingy room, 20 feet square, with a faded green carpet, a grand piano, a worn-out settee with the horsehair coming through.
I remember strongly a set of bells, tubular bells, and a grand piano and a desk, and what looked to me like a telephone mouthpiece hanging from the ceiling.
A microphone of the type commonly used in public telephone boxes was suspended in front of each performer. We have one of those old microphones here, and we also have with us the first singer whose name appears in such records as exist of our early programs. So here's an impression of what it sounded like to listeners at that time.
Cecil Lewis, a much decorated fighter pilot in the First World War, later one of the BBC's first radio producers.
Calling, 2LO calling. That was Drake Goes West, sung by Mr. Leonard Hawke, baritone. 1 moment, please, while we move the piano.
We had a habit of holding up the programs to move pianos and microphones about. Also, every 7 minutes, we had to close down for 3 minutes, in case we were interfering with the government services.
And joining them in the tiny studio at Marconi House was the classical pianist Maurice Cole.
It would be, I think, in the autumn of 1922, and in due course we fixed up that I should play it, I think, about half a dozen short, very short programs for a very, very tiny fee. And these were to be specially transmitted, to be received at the first all-British radio exhibition, I think that's what they called it, that was held in a hall not very far away from Marconi House.
On September the 30th, 1922, this place, the Royal Horticultural Hall in Pimlico, was the venue for Britain's first wireless exhibition. So this cavernous sort of Edwardian hall would have been full of exhibitors and manufacturers and radio clubs and societies and all the rest of it. And I've got a copy here of the very first programme. So September the 30th, Saturday, you could have heard at 3 o'clock Mr. Rodney Bennett, baritone, in Summertime on Breedon. Mr. Walter Glynn, tenor, country folk. Miss Catherine Last, for solo violin. Then the next day, Monday, October the 2nd, my birthday, humorist, just said selected, so you don't know what you're getting with him. Mr. Rex Faithful, baritone, Glorious Devon. It's all splendid stuff, and of course it would all have been broadcast to the people in this hall from Marconi House. These weren't people performing live. This was the first radio broadcast of this kind of material to a kind of captive audience, I suppose.
And it was a great adventure to broadcast, of course. I remember one man coming up to tell me, we call them studio managers nowadays, I think they were balance and control or something in those days, came up and whispered in my ear while I was playing It's coming over very nicely. I was nearly put off. I nearly stopped at this point, you know.
What the radio manufacturers really wanted, of course, was to shift their products. The problem was that people would only fork out for a set if there was regular material for them to listen to. The delay in the general introduction of wireless broadcasting, said the Daily News, is a sore blow to our pride in our business efficiency. The thing has been in the air for some 6 months. The public has been ready to give wireless a warm welcome. But like people on the wrong wavelength, we can only hear vague rumours of more conferences. At last, on the 18th of October 1922, in the august premises of the Institution of Electrical Engineers, the British Broadcasting Company was signed into existence, with, as Jean Seaton observes, a rather clever arrangement.
They don't want one company to get to be the monopoly business that sells all the radios in Britain. So what they do is they biff heads together and say, well, you've all got to get together in a company and we'll produce a company that will then produce the broadcasting, which you all have to take. And what's interesting about that is that, if you like, there's this other model, I think, that's going on that goes right the way back again to the end of the 19th century, which is a kind of, dare I say it, Fabian tradition of the public utility. So they call on this notion of a public utility, and that hostility towards commercialisation and commercial monopoly is transmuted by John Reith when he gets to set up the BBC into hostility to commercial takeover. It's an extraordinary story. It starts with we don't want a monopoly of one firm making radios, and it ends up with a monopoly of one firm making broadcasts of radios. How you do that particular bit of turning a pig's ear into a silk purse is genius.
Thus, sponsored by those 6 great firms, the British Broadcasting Company came into being. And to Stanton Jeffries I sent a memorandum, which perhaps may be considered a milestone in the history of British broadcasting, which Jeffries has treasured. The document he will now read to you.
A.R. Burrows to L. Stanton Jeffries, London Station Director. The British Broadcasting Committee has arranged to transmit the following programme each evening, Saturdays and Sundays included, until further notice, from the London Broadcasting Station 2LO. 6 p.m. News Bulletin, 8 to 9 music, 9 to 9:30 news, 9:30 to 10 music.
This is 2LO, the London station of the British Broadcasting Company calling. 2LO calling.
The director of Marconi's London wireless station, Stanton Jeffries, and before him, Arthur Burrows. The BBC was born in the middle of a political tornado. Then as now, Britain was governed by a coalition of Conservatives and Liberals. But the very next day after the foundation of the new company, the Tories decided to walk out of the coalition. David Lloyd George's government collapsed and a general election was called for Wednesday, the 15th of November.
Here is the last news bulletin for today. General Situation Section. The following items of news indicate...
The BBC's very first broadcast, a news bulletin read by Arthur Burrows of the Marconi Company, took place on the 14th. The day before Britain went to the polls. It was a landmark in our cultural history, but at the time it was largely overshadowed by the excitement of the coming election. The new company hadn't yet appointed the man who was to lead it, a Scottish political activist called John Reith, who would shape the entire course of broadcasting in this country. It was not until a month later, on the 14th of December, that Reith went for a job interview in the offices of the AEG Engineering Company, Magnet House.
And this rather unprepossessing spot is where they set up shop. This is now a site on Kingsway. It's 60s office blocks, all that's worst about 1960s modernism. But actually in the 1920s this was Magnet House. It was one of many magnet houses all across the country owned by GEC. And this is the place that Reith chose as the location for the BBC's very first offices. The studios were down on the other end of Kingsway, and they used to say it was an enlivening sprint from the office down to the studio. So, let's go. So we're going down Kingsway now. I have to confess, I'm not sprinting because I'm probably fatter than the BBC's original staff would have been in the 1920s. But you get a sense, I suppose, of the kind of journey they'd have made every day, you know, running down from the offices to the studio. And if you'd been coming down here in 1922, you'd have come to Marconi House on the end, but first you'd have gone past one of the great icons of the BBC, Bush House, which back then was a building site. They were still doing it, so they'd have come dashing round the corner, past all the scaffolding and the builders and the dust and the noise, and down to the bottom to Marconi.
But the biggest joke of all, as it seems now, was that during the daytime, the studio itself was used as an office by my old friend Jeff, the station director, more officially known as Mr. Stanton Jeffries.
Yes, there I sat while engineers tested microphones, a typist clicked away morning, noon and night, and streams of artists poured in begging for engagements.
There was no precedent, no store of experience to be tapped, no staff ready to hand with metal proved in a similar field. It was all left to us.
If you think, what models have they got?
Professor Jean Seaton, the BBC's historian.
They've got the model of the concert. You go to the concert and you hear the concert and you go home. You know, it's a one-off thing. They've got newspapers which are a bit nearer the mark. Films. Well, films, you go and see a film, then you go home. So they've got to discover what this odd thing that broadcasting will be and when it will be in people's lives and what time of day it will happen, and it will go on continuously. It's only about 1924, there's a wonderful manual about how to listen. You know, that you should sit down, listen very carefully, and Reith gets incredibly exercised by the notion that people might listen like water on a tap. You know, you turn the water on and they just go on listening. And that would mean that they weren't giving the proper kind of attention to each individual programme. So you had gaps between programmes at first in order to sort of cleanse the hearing palate.
Nobody could tell to what extent broadcasting would catch on, nor indeed whether it would take on at all.
For the pioneers of radio like Arthur Burroughs, it must have seemed an experience to set beside the adventures of Victorian explorers like Stanley and Livingstone, a journey into untouched, mysterious territory with no maps or compasses to guide them, discovering all the potential and the problems along the way. Leading the explorers was, of course, John Reith, and at his side, his assistant, Ruth Cockerton.
If he telephoned your office, and if you didn't immediately recognise his voice, even if you'd never heard it before, you were almost liable to instant execution.
And 3 rings on your telephone
Yes.
usually meant that the director was on the phone.
Yes. 1 ring was an ordinary person, 2 rings was the controller,
That's
Admiral
right.
Carpendale, 3 rings was the Director General.
That's right. And
And once the telephone rang 4 times, and somebody said, well, that must be God.
Following items of news indicate the general situation in the country.
This is the national programme from
Copyright
London.
in these
BBC
items
Productions Director is going to talk to you tonight about some forthcoming...
High Mass in Westminster Cathedral today, His Eminence Cardinal Bourne
His
made
London
the
caller,
following
Mr. R.C. Michelson.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of our weekly broadcasts to our listeners in Europe.
Santos Cassani, the famous teacher of dancing.
This new dance, being introduced to this country, consists of different variations taken from the blues, tango, charleston.
Now, here is Marion Cram, who is going to give you another of her garden talks.
Well, then, do you remember the notices that hung about in the studios?
Yes.
Like, don't cough, you may deafen thousands, or please refer to listeners and not listeners in.
And the man who issued that edict was inevitably John Reith himself. As a son of the manse, as the saying goes, Reith filled the early airwaves with religion. And as the momentous broadcasting year of 1922 slipped into the first days of 1923, Reith chose a sober ecclesiastical voice, Dr. Archibald Fleming of St. Columba's Church, Pont Street, to welcome in the new year. The good Dr. Fleming did so in memorably gloomy style, although he did strike an appropriately seafaring note.
To be the last in the year 1922 to speak to you is a responsibility before which the most confident might quake. For you are about to transship from the vessel which bore you across the sea of 1922 into that which is now to carry you over the uncharted waters of 1923. And to me is given the opportunity of advising you what to take along with you and what you had better leave behind. Many thousands who are at this moment invisibly grouped in this wonderful whispering gallery will never reach the end of the New Year's voyage at all.
But for Reith, Burroughs, Eckersley and Lewis, the voyage into 1923 was to be the beginning of a golden era.
So the next leg of our little tour of this corner of London takes us to the third place that the BBC occupied, because the very next year they needed bigger facilities, basically. They moved just down the Strand to a new building, which was the Institution of Electrical Engineers. Savoy Hill, they called it.
I think we can't underestimate the importance or excitement of the Savoy Hill days.
The writer and expert on radio history, Sean Street.
Because it was a string of firsts. It was the first outside broadcast. It was the first Ascot. It was the first Wimbledon. It was the first boat race. It was the first symphony concert. All these things were happening for the very first time. Everything was a new challenge. Everything was testing the medium.
This is the national programme. Now we're going to take you over to Wimbledon for a running commentary on the All-English Championship by Colonel Brand.
Here we are again in the centre court of Wimbledon, just in time for the end of...
And this is it. 2 Savoy Hill was the address. There it is, number 2. It's all blocked off now. It's a sort of door that they don't use. On the side of this great, handsome, red brick building behind the Savoy Hotel. But even so, there's something nice, really, to think that these are the steps. That's the entrance. That's the portal they'd have walked through when they went upstairs to go and do those pioneering first broadcasts.
When I first told my friends that I was going to Persia, I discovered that to most of them, Persia was little more than a
Now we're
vague
taking you
romantic
over to St Hilary, Cornwall for the first broadcast of the Nativity play. Mr Filson Young is in
But I liked the one that was hung out up in the corridor with a few lengths of fire hose and a whistle. And it said, in case of fire, blow this whistle loud and long.
And it's nice, actually. They've got the plaque here with the original BBC logo. I actually prefer it to the current logo. From 1923 to 1932, it says, the studios and offices of the British Broadcasting Company and its successor, the British Broadcasting Corporation, were in this building. It's funny, actually, because I must have walked past this building or walked near it dozens, hundreds of times. It's one of those big London office institution buildings that you walk past and you never think about it. You don't think twice, you just walk past it. And yet, it was here that I suppose the BBC had its, if not its first home, then this was its first heart, really.
Little Betty Bouncer is kind to her people and a nice girl more or less.
But at present, in those days it was a pretty nerve-wracking experience because the studios, or at any rate one of them, very heavily draped with curtains, and if you were a singer your voice felt as if it had simply gone out of the window, flat as could be.
Little Miss Bouncer loves an announcer down at the BBC.
And if you were an instrumentalist you wondered what on earth had happened.
One of the BBC's first and most famous announcing voices, Stuart Hibbard.
And then the microphone was a most uninspiring object. It was a very fearsome-looking thing until it was covered by a rather artistic-looking silk, blue and gold silk case. I remember we used to call it the artistic meat set.
Little Miss Bouncer loves an announcer down at the BBC.
So the great thing about this place was, in many ways, the location. We are really right in the heart of Theatreland. So you can get people from the West End theatres, you can get people who are performing at the Savoy Theatre. Perfectly placed for the BBC's first house band, the Savoy Orpheans, so they're just a couple of minutes away. Because you're on the embankment, you're quite close to Parliament, you can get politicians in, you can get people from their clubs, from St James's, had a few drinks, come up to do a broadcast. And there was this sort of very convivial, warm, friendly atmosphere. As one of the first sort of meeters and greeters, I suppose, Arthur Phillips remembered.
Oh, it was very, very chummy indeed, and particularly after 5:30. I would have to accompany people to the studio. I can remember taking up Amy Johnson, Gracie Fields, C.B. Cochrane, Edgar Wallace, take them up to the studios, and the atmosphere was really chummy. After all, there weren't many people on the staff in those days. We all knew each other and so on. My greatest moment when I found John Snagg knew my name. Mind you, he only said, Philip's going to get my supper, but at least that was something. So at 5:30, Colonel R.H. Brand, who was called the host, and the 2 duty announcers for the evening used to don black ties, and they would greet the artists in the hall as they came, give them a drink, and then conduct them up to the studios, and the announcer would stay with them, having made the announcement, and bring them down afterwards back into the green room, where he would hand them an envelope containing their fee, which the night cashier had given to him just prior to the broadcast.
The BBC was on its way. Savoy Hill, for all its shortcomings and lack of space, was a congenial place. The cascade of performers pouring through its studios grew into a mighty river of talent. There was perhaps one little whisper of cloud on John Reith's horizon, the appearance of one Captain Leonard Plugg, who in 1925 persuaded Selfridges to sponsor Britain's first commercial radio broadcast from that notorious den of iniquity, Paris. Soon Reith's monopoly would face a more sustained commercial challenge, and soon Britain itself would be plunged into the Second World War, perhaps wireless's finest hour. But that, as they say, is another story. For the time being, it was all such fun.
There'll be soft lights and sweet music.
And I think it cannot be more sufficiently emphasized that pioneer adventure was born in laughter, was nurtured in laughter, and died in laughter.
Some of them scheming and some of them dreaming of love.
London calling. We are now taking you over to the Savoy Hotel for dance music by the Savoy Orpheans and Havana bands until midnight. Good night, everybody. Good night.
The concert's ended, sad wails the heterodyne. You must soon switch off your valves, I must soon switch off mine. Good night, CQ, God bless you and keep you. I can't. God bless you, good night, good night.